Charles Fraser. The Magician. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 15. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go Audio production. Holmes, I implore you, please stop this at once. My voice sounded just as irritated as I truly was, my gaze fixed upon Holmes's walking stick, which he was striking against the chair leg every second. And he had been doing this for no less than 20 minutes. 20 minutes during which we had been waiting for our new client. Holmes's gaze fell once again upon the wall clock, his face contorted with such contempt that I almost felt sorry for our client should she ever arrive. Holmes despised unpunctuality, and God help anyone who kept him waiting too long. "What do you already know about the woman?" I asked Holmes, hoping to distract him somewhat. "You speak of this disrespectful female being whose lived arrogance is about to steal my precious time," he replied snappishly. "That's exactly who I mean," I replied emotionlessly. Holmes took a deep breath before answering. Mrs. Victoria Scott is a well-to-do married woman of middle age. Her husband, Philip Scott, owner of a prestigious law firm in Oxford Street, has vanished without a trace since their joint visit to the Adelphi Theatre 3 days ago. I perked up. Disappeared? Was he kidnapped? Or did he go to the lavatory and never return? A slight smirk was written across my face, but Holmes shook his head. "Neither, Watson. Mr. and Mrs. Scott attended a magic show at the Adelphi. Philip Scott was selected during the performance to participate in a magic trick." "Let me guess," I interrupted my friend. "The magician made him disappear." "So to speak, Watson, but Mrs. Scott herself shall tell us the particulars, provided she is still willing to appear today." And there it was again, Holmes's unmistakable irritation. There was a gentle knock at the door. Holmes raised his eyebrows and wrinkled his nose in contempt. I hoped Holmes would not be too harsh in his judgment of Mrs. Scott. "Come in," Holmes uttered sharply. A delicate creature, her blonde hair tied neatly in a bun at the nape of her neck, floated into our modest quarters. Her finely chiselled features with high-set cheekbones and full lips expressed sheer desperation and grief. She extended her hand in greeting, almost helplessly. Yet Holmes and I stood motionless, staring at this enchanting, extraordinary woman. At last, Holmes collected himself and returned her greeting by bestowing a charming kiss upon her hand. I, however, confined myself to a gentle handshake. Holmes rushed to the chair and fluffed up the cushion. Only then did he invite her to take a seat. Embarrassed, he mumbled something about refreshments or a cup of coffee, which Mrs. Scott politely declined. Then my friend settled back into his wing chair and glanced shyly across at our new client. I smiled to myself. I no longer needed to worry about Holmes being too brusque with Mrs. Scott. I waited for Holmes to take the lead as usual, but nothing happened. I cleared my throat as a reminder, but when there was still no reaction from Holmes, I posed my question to Mrs. Scott. "My name is Dr. Watson. I am Mr. Holmes's partner. Mr. Holmes has told me that your husband has vanished without a trace. Could you perhaps tell us what happened on that evening?" Victoria Scott gazed at me with large, light blue eyes, then began to tell her story in a melodious voice. "My husband Philip and I visited the Adelphi Theatre 3 days ago, on Friday, to watch the magic show of the great Damiano. The evening was thoroughly pleasant. My husband and I were in good spirits. It had been a long time since we had gone out together. My husband usually works until late at night." Victoria Scott paused briefly, then continued. "Philip and I chatted throughout the entire evening. We paid little attention to the magic show, and when we did, we were rather amused by the mediocre tricks of the magician." "You weren't really interested in the show then?" Oh, it seemed Holmes had finally found his voice again. Victoria Scott gazed deeply into Holmes's eyes. Was I imagining it, or did Holmes blush slightly around his aquiline nose? "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Scott's voice rang out. "I merely wonder why one would attend a magic show and explicitly purchase tickets for it if one had no interest in it," Holmes replied. That man had no sense of romance. "Holmes, I think that evening was simply about spending time together. The dimmed lights, a touch of magic in the air. But I suppose Mr. and Mrs. Scott could have attended a boxing match just as well. When two people are enough for each other, it ultimately doesn't matter which event they attend." "I agree with you, Dr. Watson, but Mr. Holmes is not entirely wrong. We did not purchase the tickets for the show. They were given to us as a gift." "That sounds interesting. And from whom?" asked Holmes. "It was a gift from the employees at my husband's law firm. Although his birthday was a little while ago, perhaps they wanted to give him an evening free from work in this way." Was all Holmes said, whilst thoughtfully scratching his chin. "But please continue with your story, Mrs. Scott," I urged her. The evening was drawing to a close, and it seemed the final act of the show was about to begin. The assistant wheeled in a large black box. It could be opened with 3 doors and easily provided enough space for a grown man inside. Then the great Damiano asked the audience who would like to volunteer as a guinea pig and be made invisible. Although several people in the audience volunteered, it almost seemed to me as if this Damiano was purposefully heading towards us. Yet Philip hadn't even raised his hand. He would never. Her voice broke off and she desperately shook her pretty head. "You mean this Damiano specifically chose your husband?" "I'm quite certain," she sniffled. "How did things proceed?" Holmes wanted to know. Philip gave me one last kiss and squeezed my hand. Then he reluctantly followed this Damiano. He led my husband onto the stage and asked him to step into the black box. Then Damiano made a tasteless joke and called out to me, saying I should take a good look at my husband as it would be the last time I would see him. Little did I know how right he would be. Then he closed the 3 black panels, turned the box several times in one direction, then in the other, until the box finally came to rest in its original position. Portentously, he opened first the top panel, then the middle one, and finally the bottom one. The box was empty. The audience burst into applause. Damiano bowed several times and basked in the acclaim, then ended his show. I remained in my seat until the hall had emptied, waiting for my husband. But he didn't come, so I decided to go to the stage, where several men were busy clearing away the equipment. At first, they just stared at me stupidly. I told them I was waiting for my husband, but one of them just said I should forget him and run away with him instead. They all laughed obscenely until finally, the eldest of the group took pity and directed me backstage to Damiano. I could still hear their dirty laughter when I finally found the door to Damiano's dressing room. I knocked, and he immediately opened it himself. He pretended not to recognize me, but I could see in his eyes that he was lying. He told me he had made my husband vanish, just like that. That was true magic, he said. He couldn't tell me anything more. Then he started praising himself for the successful show, but I wasn't listening anymore. I left the theatre, waited for about half an hour at the entrance, then went to the back exit and waited there for some time as well. Then I walked the streets several times on foot, but at 2:30 in the morning, I finally realised my endeavour was pointless and decided to go home. I called a taxi and was full of hope that perhaps Philip would already be waiting for me at home, even though deep down this seemed unlikely. And that's exactly how it was. Our house was empty, everything was dark. Victoria Scott closed her eyes and I could virtually feel her pain. Entirely against Holmes's nature, he took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Mrs. Scott, I promise you, we shall do everything within our power to find your husband." A single tear ran down Victoria Scott's cheek, making her appear even more fragile, even more beautiful. I assume you want to seek out this magician Damiano first, I concluded, whilst Holmes had already made himself comfortable in his armchair, drawing on his pipe as I hastily opened the window to let in some fresh air. Quite right, Watson. Holmes nodded, only to wrinkle his nose in contempt moments later. Magic! What utter nonsense! He took another deep draw from his pipe. As far as I know, the evening performance begins at 8 o'clock. We shall observe this hocus-pocus for ourselves tonight. You will accompany me, old friend, won't you? I waved the smoke out of the window with my right hand and replied, But of course, I wouldn't miss it for the world. The Adelphi Theatre was nearly filled to capacity. Spellbound, I awaited the start of the show, whilst Holmes rather gave off an impression of boredom. Suddenly, the lights dimmed, and all conversations fell silent. A small, portly man, dressed entirely in black, stepped in front of the curtain and raised both hands. Theatrically, he called out, I, the great Damiano, welcome you to my legendary show. Allow me to enchant you and immerse you in a world of impossibilities. I promise you shall be delighted. The audience applauded whilst Holmes fixed his gaze upon Damiano, never taking his eyes off him. The curtain was hoisted. A black-haired woman, whose skimpy costume was clearly too tight and too figure-hugging, was already waiting for Damiano at a black table. My enchanting assistant Mandy, Damiano introduced her. The audience delivered the desired applause once more, and the magician and his assistant bowed. Then both stepped up to the table, and the assistant suddenly held a deck of cards in her hand. When Holmes saw this, he sighed discontentedly and rolled his eyes. A card trick, how ordinary. A rope trick followed, then one with a small black box in which the great magician made a banknote from the audience disappear. Most certainly into his own pocket, never to be seen again, as Holmes remarked. Then came a mirror trick, after which the good man made his less than enchanting assistant levitate, which bordered on being a trick in itself, Holmes noted, considering Mandy's substantial figure. Damiano could, of course, also swallow swords, and if that wasn't enough, he then stepped into a white box and let his assistant pierce him with additional swords, only to emerge from the box completely unharmed moments later. If that top hat with the white rabbit appears now, I'm leaving, Holmes remarked sharply. But now it truly became interesting. A large black box with 3 hinged doors was pushed onto the stage by Mandy. Who wants to be the star of tonight's performance? Called Damiano. Who will volunteer to assist me? Damiano looked around the hall as if he were searching for something, or rather someone. Here we have a volunteer, Holmes shouted loudly, gesticulating wildly towards me. Have you lost your mind? I hissed at him angrily, while sliding deeper and deeper into my chair. Oh, don't be such a spoil-sport, Watson. This will be extremely helpful to our cause. But thank heavens, Damiano paid no attention to Holmes whatsoever. Holmes could wave his arms about as wildly as he liked. No, instead, Damiano purposefully approached a certain individual. Spellbound, we watched the scene. The man had neither volunteered, nor did he seem particularly keen to stand up and follow Damiano onto the stage. In the end, however, he had no choice, as the audience was thoroughly enjoying themselves and loudly urged the stranger to follow the magician. Upon reaching the stage, Damiano asked the man, "What is your name, sir?" "I'm quite certain he knows the answer," Holmes hissed to me once again. "My name is George Denver." "Well then, Mr. Denver, would you be so kind as to step into our box?" George Denver hesitated for a brief moment, but then did as he was told. Mandy closed the 3 hinged doors with much fuss. Then Damiano mumbled a few sentences which I could not understand, and tapped his magic wand against the box 3 times. The box was then rotated 3 times on its own axis until it finally came to rest in its original position. With mounting tension, Mandy first opened the upper flap, then the middle one, and finally the bottom one. And behold, the box was empty. Holmes snatched his cane and sprang up. "Come along, Watson. We must find the man." Of course, Holmes was right. Everything indicated that George Denver would otherwise become our second missing person. Hastily, I rushed after Holmes, who hurried behind the stage under the irritated glances of the audience. "Mr. Denver!" he called out. We nervously glanced in all directions, but there was no sign of George Denver. "Watson, let's check if the stage has a secret door. I mean one that leads underneath." Together, we searched the entire back area of the stage. However, we could find neither a secret door nor any other clue. I shrugged my shoulders helplessly. Suddenly, Damiano appeared with his assistant. "What the devil are you looking for here?" he thundered. "Access is strictly forbidden to spectators in this area." "We were looking for Mr. Denver," replied Holmes. "Who?" asked Damiano stupidly, until it seemed to finally dawn on him. "You mean the chap I made disappear? Well, you'll be searching for quite a while." "Where is he?" asked Holmes sharply. "I made him disappear, enchanted him, simply gone." "Ah, stop talking such nonsense and tell me immediately where Mr. Denver is," Holmes demanded. But Damiano only smiled smugly and said defiantly, "Or what?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and I am already searching for Mr. Scott, whom you made vanish without a trace 3 days ago. And you intend to do the same with Mr. Denver, but I swear to you, I shall bring about your downfall and get to the bottom of these events." "Then do so," replied Damiano, unimpressed. "I am a magician and I have enchanted someone, and now that is my job." "We shall meet again soon, Mr. Damiano," Holmes threatened. He turned around without another glance and walked back into the hall. I followed closely behind him. The hall had meanwhile almost emptied. Only a middle-aged woman sat lonely and alone still in her seat, waiting patiently for her husband's return. This must have been exactly how Victoria Scott had sat there 3 days ago, waiting for her vanished husband. Holmes and I approached the abandoned woman. "You must be Mrs. Denver, I presume. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my partner, Dr. Watson. Would you mind if we joined you for a moment?" Mrs. Denver was not entirely comfortable, but she ultimately offered us to take a seat on one of the empty chairs. "You are waiting for your husband?" Holmes inquired politely. "Did you see the show? The great Damiano made him disappear, and now I'm simply waiting for him. I'm quite eager to hear what he'll tell me about it." Watson and I exchanged a meaningful glance. "Madam, I do not believe your husband will return any time soon," said Holmes in a calm voice. "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Denver asked uncomprehendingly. 3 days ago, a man was also made to disappear in this box. He has not resurfaced to this day. Mrs. Denver turned chalk white and began to sway. "I shall fetch her a glass of water," I offered thoughtfully. "Meanwhile, you can inform Mrs. Denver about the incidents." Holmes nodded to me, and I set off in search of a waiter. Since the show had long since ended, this endeavour proved somewhat difficult. Nevertheless, it ought to be possible to procure a glass of water. Ah yes, here next to the cloakroom area was a sort of bar, so I patiently positioned myself at the bar and waited for my luck to change. But quietly. Yes, the door behind the bar, which presumably led to the beverage storage room, stood open. Inside, I could quite clearly hear 2 people conversing. "Something's not right about this," said one of them. "First, that fellow hasn't been seen since Damiano made him vanish 3 days ago. And did you catch that? Now it's happened again today. Perhaps the poor chaps simply didn't want to return to their wives," laughed the other one. The first one shook his head. "I don't believe that. Something's not right here. The show has been running for a good fortnight now, and until now, the person has always reappeared straight afterwards. The whole thing gives me the creeps." I cleared my throat loudly to draw attention to myself. At that moment, a young lad in waiter's livery poked his head through the door. "Ah, would you be so kind as to bring a glass of water for the waiting lady?" I asked politely. "But of course, sir," the waiter hastened to reply. A short while later, I returned to Holmes and Mrs Denver with a glass of water in hand. Mrs Denver wept quietly but gratefully accepted my water. Once she had calmed down somewhat, Holmes and I escorted her to a taxi that would take her home. We had exchanged addresses in case we needed to ask Mrs Denver any further questions, and naturally, vice versa. I also hailed a taxi for us, and Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. "I overheard a conversation between the waiters," I said to Holmes. "The magic show has been running for a good fortnight, and today is the second time that someone has failed to reappear after being enchanted. Therefore, there must not have been any other incidents." "Very good, Watson. Now the only question is why Mr Scott and Mr Denver specifically became victims of the show. What do they have in common?" Holmes pondered. "Same circle of friends?" I suggested. "No, rather unlikely. At least Mrs Denver does not know the Scott family. I have already looked into that. Once upon a time, there was an old nanny goat who had 7 little kids." "Not that either. Mr Denver is employed by the city planning department, while Mr Scott works as a solicitor." I could practically sense the wheels turning in Holmes's head. We spent the remainder of the taxi journey in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. A solicitor and a city employee. Where might the connection lie? Was there even one? And what did this peculiar magician Damiano have to do with it? Or were we completely barking up the wrong tree? The next morning, when I entered our sitting room, Holmes was crouched in the middle of the floor, surrounded by today's newspapers and the daily papers from at least the past fortnight. "Oh no!" I exclaimed. "Good morning, Watson. I have been waiting for you. Come, sit with me and grab a newspaper." Feeling dejected, I sat down on the floor next to Holmes, while simultaneously wondering whether I would ever be able to get up again without assistance. "The wolf and the 7 young kids," said Holmes. "Alice will bring us a little something to eat, at the latest when she hasn't heard from us by noon." Those were not promising prospects. "What are we searching for?" I asked listlessly. "We're searching for articles about this Damiano chap, about people who have vanished without a trace, and about construction projects." "Ah, how lovely that you're keeping the range of possible search items so narrow," I said sarcastically, and snatched up the first newspaper. The day passed tortuously slowly. For my part, I did not find a single useful clue, and Holmes did not look very happy and satisfied either. Suddenly, my friend put aside the newspaper he had just been leafing through and, with some effort, got back to his feet with the help of his walking stick. "Up, up, old chap," he said. "We have an appointment." "And that would be?" I replied wearily. "Do you know by now what sort of occupation Mr Ford pursued?" asked Holmes. Wolford nodded. Mr Ford was a retired teacher. But I should have known better. Any objections on my part fell on deaf ears once Holmes had made up his mind, and so I put on a decent shirt and dutifully accompanied my friend to this infernal show. He worked at Woldingham School for many years, but what I find extremely interesting is that Mr Ford was employed as a private tutor for the Kent family for several years in between. "Do you mean the Kent banking family?" I asked in astonishment. "How, the disappearance of both men is certainly paying off for Damiano," I remarked, whilst looking around the sold-out auditorium. "You may be right about that, Watson. However, I do wonder who would still volunteer for the final act today." I could not suppress a smile. My friend's dry statement hit the nail on the head. The show was opened by Damiano, and straight away he had his cards in his hands. "Oh no," moaned Holmes. I could have told you beforehand that this Damiano chap churns out the same programme day after day, I replied irritably. If only he would at least do it well, but these silken beginner's tricks that anyone can see through at first glance. Holmes shook his head. To Paris? Please wait a brief moment. Holmes hurried to his room and suddenly appeared quite excited. When he returned a few minutes later, he was waving a sheet of paper in his hand. I knew it, he said triumphantly. See for yourself. Holmes handed Inspector Wolford and me the newspaper clipping. I read aloud. Explosion at a Parisian manor house. The charred body of the elderly Monsieur Beauchamp was recovered from beneath the partially collapsed foundations. The Paris police suspect arson and murder. A reliable source confirmed receipt of a confession letter sent to the Paris police. It was signed The Big Bad Wolf and the Three Little Pigs. The Paris police are requesting any information regarding this matter. Look closely, Watson. The good lady is hanging by a silken thread. I don't believe that silken thread would even support this Mandy, Holmes. Wait, I shall prove it to you, he said, rising and hurrying onto the stage. Holmes and I had settled in for a few quiet days. It would certainly take some time before old Mr. Kent's son could be tracked down in Paris and subsequently brought to London. The audience applauded, but then Damiano noticed Holmes. You again, he greeted him just as unfriendly as yesterday. Holmes took the wand from Damiano's hand and said, Well, that's no wonder. The lady is not resting on anything. She is hanging by an invisible thread. Then he moved the wand slightly above Mandy's head and stopped at shoulder height. Mandy jerked. You see, Watson, just as I told you, he called out loudly to me, whilst I covered my eyes with one hand and turned red with embarrassment. However, Damiano's face also changed colour. Would you kindly leave my stage now? He hissed at Holmes. Visibly disappointed, Holmes put his pipe aside. Then my journey will have to wait a little while longer, whether I like it or not. Watson, swing your toes out of that ice-cold brew. We have an appointment. Very well, Damiano purred. Then please take a seat here behind the table, and when it is your turn, you may step forward. Holmes was satisfied with that for the time being. Now it was time for the sword-swallowing trick. Mandy handed her employer his sword and, with incredible theatrics, Damiano finally thrust the sword into his throat. The audience applauded again. But then Holmes emerged again. He took the sword back from Damiano's hand, gripped the handle with both hands, and pointed the sword's tip towards his stomach. With a forceful jerk, he thrust the sword into his belly and the audience held their breath. So did I. Heavens above, Holmes. However, nothing happened. Holmes tilted his head slightly to one side, released the sword handle with one hand, and triumphantly raised the sword high with the other hand. But what was this? He was only holding the handle of the sword. The blade had completely retracted into the sword's handle. The audience cheered and whooped. It seemed to me that Damiano was finally about to perform a genuine magic trick, as his head began visibly smoking, and steam appeared to rise from his rather receding hairline. Holmes also seemed to notice this. I believe I shall return to my seat after all, he said, and left the stage to thunderous applause. Damiano tried to save his show and began with the next act. He stepped into the white box to be pierced by swords wielded by his assistant Mandy. For confirmation, Mandy raised the first sword once more into the air before forcefully thrusting it into the notch of the box, directly at chest height. A pain-filled scream suddenly flooded the theatre. Then all fell silent. The audience gazed spellbound at the stage. No one quite knew where the scream had come from. This was followed by hysterical shrieking from Mandy. Blood slowly seeped from the box, but in a great stream. Holmes rushed back onto the stage, and I, too, leapt from my seat and hurried forward. Holmes tore open the doors of the box, and a sword-pierced Damiano fell into his arms. Carefully, Holmes laid the bleeding man on the ground. I knelt beside the victim, but knew immediately that this man was dead. I checked his vital signs, but there was nothing more I could do for him. He was dead. It did not take long before Inspector Wolford arrived. We briefed him about the sequence of events and informed him about the two missing men. One thing is now beyond question. Damiano had a second helping hand, and I wager this person is also responsible for the disappearance of both men, Holmes concluded. Bizza, he most certainly became frightened after the disappearance became public knowledge, and he learnt that you both, Holmes and Watson, had been scrutinising the magician, Inspector Wolford speculated. Most likely he was at the show yesterday and watched comfortably from his seat, I said. I rather doubt that, Watson. I believe this someone was working behind or beneath the stage. After all, someone must have received Mr. Scott and Mr. Denver. Or do you really think Damiano would have made them disappear? Holmes mocked me. Offended, I said nothing more and retreated to a corner. Thus, I left Holmes and Inspector Wolford to conduct the questioning of the stage personnel alone. When the two returned, I could tell from their expressions that this lead also led nowhere. "What opportunity brought you to London, then?" asked Holmes. "Come now, old chap," Holmes tried in a conciliatory manner. "Where are we going, then?" I asked, making an effort to give my voice an emotionless tone. Inspector Wolford takes us to the hotel room where Damiano had temporarily resided. I rose from my quiet little spot in the corner and followed the two super detectives at a respectable distance. The hotel room was shabby. I could hardly believe that the great Damiano had actually spent his nights here, especially since he surely earned enough from his nightly performances at the Adelphi. Holmes and Inspector Wolford meticulously examined the small room together, whilst I devoted myself to the modestly furnished bookshelf. I took out a book in a brown cover, without any visible title, and began leafing through it. At that moment, I noticed that a single slip of paper was hidden between the pages. I took it out and read, "Bud's Pawnbrokers, Buying and Selling. We turn everything into cash." Now I had Holmes's complete attention. "Where did you get that?" "This was inside the book," I said. "Show me that," said Holmes, approaching me and taking the slip of paper from my hand. "Do you think I cannot read this properly?" I asked snippily. Now Holmes ignored me and continued reading. "One golden pocket watch, redeemable up to 60 days after date of issue. Amount received, £200. "A pawnbroker's ticket?" asked Inspector Wolford, who now studied the slip of paper with the same interest as Holmes himself. "Precisely. This could be an important lead. You've done very well, Watson," Holmes praised me. And with that, I was almost reconciled again. "I just wonder why Damiano found it necessary to pawn a valuable watch," said Inspector Wolford. "Well, it would match this room here. We shall get to the bottom of this. Come along, Watson." Half an hour later, we stood in front of the pawnbroker's shop, which was, unfortunately, closed. "And now, shall we wait?" I asked Holmes. "No, we shall not," answered Holmes, and I had already turned to leave when I noticed that my friend was not following me. Instead, he was fiddling with the lock using a skeleton key. I hurried towards Holmes with quick steps. "Have you gone mad? This is breaking and entering." "No, truth-finding." A soft click and a broad grin appeared on Holmes's face. "Do you really want to end up in prison in your twilight years?" I tried to convince my friend. But before I knew it, Holmes had already slipped through the open door. I cursed quietly, furtively glanced in all directions, and finally followed him. "What on earth are you dragging me into this time?" A barely noticeable, soft, clattering sound came from the adjoining room. Inspector Wolford put a finger to his lips and signalled us to be quiet and follow him. With his pistol in hand, he crept forward and thrust open the door to the adjacent room with a sudden jerk. As he did so, he shouted, Scotland Yard, put your hands up! One day I shall kill him indeed. Now Holmes even turned on the gas lamp. Are you completely mad? Are you absolutely determined to get caught? I hissed in disbelief. Can you see in the dark? No. Well then. And for Holmes, the discussion appeared to be over. Quietly cursing under my breath, I opened drawers and rummaged through papers and objects. It was unimaginable what an assortment of valuable and less valuable items had accumulated here. A pawnbroker's shop appeared to be quite a profitable business. "Watson, come over here," my friend said loudly, pointing to a newspaper clipping stuck to the wall. "I'm coming," I said quietly. "Why are you whispering like that? There's not a soul here," Holmes scolded me. I could only shake my head at such brazenness. "What is that supposed to be?" I continued to whisper. "That's an article with a photograph of a building plot. I saw that exact same article in one of the newspapers this afternoon." Holmes appeared to be mentally absent for a brief moment. His gaze seemed to stare straight through the article and the wall. Only now did he take his eyes off the wall, and I could see in his face that he had solved the case. "Who is behind this?" I asked him joyfully. "You know me very well indeed," Holmes smiled at me. "It was the pawnbroker himself." "The pawnbroker was behind it, but we don't even know him at all," I observed. "Precisely, Watson. Nevertheless, it was indeed him. Do you see this newspaper clipping? It states that the city intends to purchase several adjacent properties to build a wider, better road in the near future. That makes sense, as there are more and more motor cars," I added. "Exactly. In this regard, I am certain that the pawnbroker owned one of these properties. Why else would he keep this article and hang it on the wall? One only does such a thing if one has a personal connection to it. Now, this is where the two missing men come into play. Mr. Denver is an employee at the city's building authority," I recalled euphorically. "But what role does Mr. Scott, the solicitor, play in all this?" "Solicitor and notary," Holmes enlightened me. "This pawnbroker sold his property to Mr. Denver on behalf of the city and had Mr. Scott certify the sale." "And why did Damiano have to make the two of them disappear?" I asked, for I truly could not make sense of it. "Due to some circumstances still unknown to me, the pawnbroker apparently wanted his property back. Either the city refused to sell it back, or he never even asked and wanted to keep the sale proceeds. I do not know. What does one do then? One makes the main protagonists of the business transaction disappear and retrieves the deed." "How do you know that?" "I read yesterday about a break-in at the city office that occurred 2 days ago. I knew of the importance of this information, but did not know how to classify it. However, I would wager with you that the break-in at the city office concerns the building department." "And what about the magician?" "Damiano was pure coincidence. Our pawnbroker acted quickly when Damiano came to his shop 5 days ago, as evidenced by the issued pawn receipt, and pawned the watch. He knew the magician desperately needed money and suggested that he make 2 people disappear during his show. He most likely presented Mr. Scott and Mr. Denver to him as old acquaintances with whom he wanted to play a prank. I'm certain that if we follow the trail at the law firm regarding where the gifted tickets came from, it will lead us directly to our mate Bud here." "Who is Bud?" I asked. "Bud's pawnbrokers. I'll just take a wild guess that our pawnbroker is also called Bud." Holmes's conclusions seemed entirely plausible to me. And when this Bud became frightened that Damiano might grass on him due to mounting public pressure, he simply swapped the prepared swords for real ones and thus let Mandy do the dirty work for him, I deduced enthusiastically. "That was quite clever thinking on your part, Watson. I believe the same." "Yes, very good, Watson." We both startled when an unfamiliar voice mimicked Holmes. We turned around and both stared into the barrel of a pistol. "You must be Bud," Holmes stated in a tone that only he could display given the situation we found ourselves in. "How very astute of you, Holmes," Bud laughed, whilst keeping the pistol trained upon us. "Where are Mr. Scott and Mr. Denver? You can tell us," Holmes coquettishly urged him. "We shall likely be joining them shortly anyway." "You're quite right about that. For your age, you still seem rather clever," Bud acknowledged approvingly. "Thank you very much," replied Holmes, still in good spirits. "So where are the two of them?" "They went for a swim, both of them, in the Thames, and they could dive quite well. You would hardly believe it," the pawnbroker answered with ice-cold composure. "Dead!" I cried out in horror. The poor, fragile Mrs. Scott," remarked Holmes with deep compassion. "And, of course, not to forget the unfortunate Mrs. Denver." To be perfectly honest, at that very moment I felt most sorry for myself, considering the fact that Holmes and I would be following those two pitiful men into the Thames for a dive. Yet Holmes had already regained his composure, and did not show his sympathy for the men who had died such a cruel death, nor for the bereaved women. "Bud, tell me one more thing. Why did you want your property back?" Bud's eyes suddenly took on a special gleam, and greed was written all over his face. He slowly walked behind his counter, the weapon steadily pointed at us, and opened the drawer. He rummaged around inside, and suddenly held a small lump in his left hand, which his fingers possessively yet almost tenderly enclosed. "Gold," he said with pride. "I found gold, quite by chance. After the sale, I wanted to take one last walk on my former land when this glittering nugget caught my eye by chance. I picked it up and examined it." Even now he continued to eye the nugget almost lovingly. "And with that you succumbed to gold fever," Holmes laughed. "May I have a look?" Bud pondered for a moment, then carefully placed the gold nugget on the counter and stepped back. He presumably thought that should Holmes wish to keep the gold, he could still shoot him immediately. Holmes approached the counter and picked up the nugget. Then he examined it carefully from all sides. He turned it over and over, and then burst out laughing. "You fool! Fool's gold! Nothing but a worthless stone that you found." Holmes placed the stone back on the counter. "No, that cannot be. You're lying. I am a professional." On the verge of hysteria, he stared at the supposed gold nugget. At that moment, the door flew open, and Inspector Walford stood in the middle of the room with his revolver drawn, accompanied by 3 additional police officers. "Hands up! Nobody move!" he shouted. But Bud did not react. He had already put down his pistol and now clutched his stone with both hands. "I believe he no longer poses a threat," Holmes greeted Inspector Walford. "Nevertheless, you're rather late. I was running out of things to discuss with this madman here. My next topic would likely have been the weather." "Please, have him arrested and taken away at last," I implored Inspector Walford. He immediately gave his officers a barely perceptible signal, and they arrested the pawnbroker without resistance. "2 grieving women remain," I summarised. "I shall tell Mrs. Scott myself," Holmes said heavily. "I promised her I would find her husband. Therefore, I am duty-bound to deliver this painful news to her." I patted my friend encouragingly on the shoulder, thus paying him the necessary respect that this honest, compassionate and brilliant man deserved. You were listening to Charles Fraser, The Magician. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 15. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go Audio production.